A very warm Pacific welcome to you all, wherever you may be. My name is Dr. Nicholas Thompson. I am the Senior Health Advisor here at the Australian Pacific Security College. And today we are bringing you a part of our webinar series from the APSC, where we look to unpack and shed light on current dimensions of security and trends in security in the context of the Pacific region. And today, we are going to be kind of cracking this open a little bit and looking at how we might advance health and security in the Pacific region. And you may be asking, why are we talking about health emanating out of the Pacific Security College? Well, the very reason we're doing that is because the Pacific Island Forum leaders have asked us to, in terms of laying out the Boe Declaration and non-traditional security threats. So livelihoods, health, water, climate are really critical going forward in terms of how we look at health and security. So there are really kind of two things that really crack open this kind of health and security nexus, which I think are important in terms of setting the scene here. The first, of course, is the Boe Declaration. Now, in 2018, the Pacific Island Forum leaders laid out their Declaration on Regional Security. And for the first time that I had seen, certainly, this idea of existential and non-traditional security threats really coming to the fore as predominant security threats. And so if you look at some of the language that comes out of the Boe Declaration from the leaders, we affirm that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, and our commitment to progress the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Furthermore, they go on to say, we affirm an expanded concept of security which addresses the wide range of security issues in the region, both traditional and non-traditional, with an increasing emphasis on human security, including humanitarian assistance, protecting the rights, health and prosperity of the Pacific people. Now, this is important because what we're seeing here is this expanded concept of security. So all of a sudden, what we might have thought was really kind of security discourse has expanded. And by definition, therefore, has to start including different actors and different stakeholders. You can't have discussions around security in the Pacific without talking about climate change. You can't have discussions about security in the Pacific without talking about biological threat prevention and animal diseases and how we might respond to non-communicable diseases, because all of these things have huge implications for economies and for development more generally, and indeed for security. Now, the second thing that happened, which really kind of drove home this whole nexus of health and security, is COVID-19. And I think never before in recent decades had we had a global pandemic of such magnitude that had varying degrees of severity, but literally involved the whole of societies. This did not target one particular group. COVID is universal in its ability to infect. And what we saw was a whole range of often security-led interactions. So, for example, whilst it might have been COVID, in Papua New Guinea we had David Manning, the police commissioner, running the COVID response. In Fiji, the police were certainly very much front and centre in playing a role in the overall government's kind of response to COVID, whether that be kind of policing social distances or setting up roadblocks, or providing assistance to people that were sick and unwell, or indeed, sadly, providing escorts to the bodies of people that had died and were being removed from hospital. So any way you kind of dice this up, security sector actors played a huge role in COVID, and that really kind of lays out to us what this kind of health and security nexus means and what it might mean for how we kind of program and strategize and develop policy for kind of whole of government, whole of society responses to non-traditional threats. Thank you. But so COVID has kind of really focused our attention, but we only need to draw back just a little bit to understand that other biological threats, before we even talk about water and food and climate, other biological threats have huge implications for health and security. Now, not many people may know what this particular delightful looking animal is, sitting away munching on a leaf. This is a fall armyworm. And fall armyworms have the ability, they travel on natural pathways, on winds, they can move a long way over a night on the trade winds. Now, fall armyworm can decimate maize crops. It targets particularly, so in implications for the Pacific, so certainly sugar, wheat, rice, are certainly the types of crops that fall armyworm would absolutely thrive on. Now, if this happens very, very quickly, you lose your crops. Now, if you lose for example, if you lost the sugar crops for a year in Fiji or any other countries that are producing a lot of sugar, can you imagine what that would do to livelihoods, economy, and ultimately to health? So as we start to expand this idea of health and security, we start to see that fall armyworm prevention or surveillance or early detection is actually a critical construct of national security. Next slide, thank you. But it's not just fall armyworm and natural pathways. We also have other biological threats like livestock diseases for sure. So many of you will be familiar with the current outbreak of foot and mouth across the Asia Pacific region. African swine fever remains an ongoing and significant threat, and we've seen outbreaks in Timor a few years ago which decimated the pig industry. And you have to remember that many people don't have huge farms with huge numbers of livestock. They might only have 1 or 2 pigs. And if those pigs have to be slaughtered, then all of a sudden, where's the livelihood, where's the food, et cetera, et cetera. So we are always one step away from a kind of an increased security risk in the context of health. Thank you. Next slide. Now, if we talk about the Pacific, we talk about kava, and here what we're seeing here is a photograph of a kava rootstock that's infected with a fungus. Now, can you imagine what would happen to the Pacific region if all of a sudden this fungi got control and took over kava crops all over the Pacific region? Then they would have to be destroyed. You could potentially wind up with a really limited supply of kava, which would have huge implications for a whole range of social dimensions and cultural dimensions, but certainly for livelihood as well, given the expanding export market and domestic trade that kava produces. Thank you. In addition, as a kind of a public health infectious disease background person, we talk about kind of other infectious diseases that are often seasonal. So in the context of the Pacific, we're constantly worried about dengue and leptospirosis and typhoid. But when you really think about these particular infections, often they're driven by lack of clean infrastructure, lack of clean access to water, the link between animals, rodents particularly, in the context of lepto, and clean water supplies. Now, the prevention of these kind of infections has as much to do with infrastructure and cleanliness and access to good hygiene as it does to access to a hospital system. So when we start to think about how we respond to these kind of ongoing threats, automatically we have to be expanding the view from which we kind of look at them from. So no longer can the Ministry of Health and Medical Services in Fiji rely solely on themselves to detect and respond and indeed to prevent seasonal outbreaks of dengue, lepto and typhoid. What we're really needing here is kind of whole of government initiatives that address areas of high concern. Now, whether they be areas of flooding or areas where rubbish, for example, is widespread, where it shouldn't be, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, you start to understand that health as a sector just simply cannot be responsible for resolving these kind of current threats. Thank you. Next slide. Now, if you take a step even further back, we start to get into invasive species. And I'm just here on these particular slides, the African tulip tree, which has become endemic across Fiji, for example. Now it might look like a kind of a nice flower, but in reality, this thing is ferocious. It grows anywhere, and it overtakes land that could otherwise be used for local food production, and indeed more large, widely spread production, whether that be of pine forests or of other kind of plant products. Furthermore, the rhinoceros beetle, which attacks coconut and coconut trees. Can you imagine the Pacific without coconuts? I certainly can't. And then, of course, we have our friend here, the American iguana, which has taken over the natural habitat of a range of other animals, which is obviously problematic for communities and people that are now having to kind of compete with a fairly resilient and tough animal. Thank you. So that's all before we start talking about some of these kind of larger, bigger issues as well, like the implications of climate and food, the nexus of climate and food. Now, so what we see with climate change is a range of things, but one of them is the warming up of the ocean. And for every kind of point degree of warming of the ocean in the Pacific, what we see is tuna migration changing. So all of a sudden, what we start to understand as just a climate issue is automatically a food security and economic livelihood issue. So these things are intimately connected any way you dice it up. Thank you. Water security. I mean, I think what, you think about rainfall, you think about, you're turning on the tap and you're getting clean water. That is just not the reality across many, certainly across many countries, but certainly for many communities in the Pacific. So how we continue to ensure access to clean water becomes a huge issue for both health and security as we're going forward. Thank you. Next slide. Now, one of the challenges here, when you talk about health and security and the nexus of it and the Boe Declaration, quite often, you can kind of get caught up in the intangible nature of these kind of commentaries. But the reality is that the Pacific Island Forum leaders have asked countries and governments around the region to give a tangible demonstration of how we are accounting for these non-traditional security threats, which have implications for health and security. And I think this is where it's really interesting. How do you actually demonstrate and respond in the context of national security by foregrounding issues of health? And I just want to talk about a couple of initiatives that we've been working on with our colleagues in Fiji for the last couple of years. I'm going to talk about the multi-agency biological threat partnerships, a Fiji-focused health and security course, and then finally some emerging work, which is really exciting, in the northern region of Fiji, looking at early warning surveillance of intersecting health and security threats. Thank you. So what we saw from COVID was this idea that almost every agency and indeed community structures had a role in responding to COVID-19. I just highlighted before just the very obvious, very obvious kind of police role and the police presence in responding to COVID. But that extended across a range of other agencies. You think about immigration and their critical role at ports of entry. You think about customs and the whole idea of what's moving through the humanitarian corridor. Was it safe? Is it safe? How do we reduce risk along those kind of pathways? You think about the biosecurity agencies. You think about departments of corrections, working and supporting, trying to support the health of closed populations. So all of a sudden, biological threats and COVID particularly really kind of broke open this idea that everyone actually has a role here. And while in many countries health was the natural lead, the ministries of health or the departments of health, that wasn't always the case in many other countries where emergency services, national disaster management, police, military, a whole range of other agencies played very front and center and significant roles. So in the context of Fiji, what we did was we spoke to some of the key stakeholders from across all these different agencies, from permanent secretary level kind of down. And what we really wanted to understand was, what was their reflective experience in managing COVID? What did their agency do well? What could their agency have done better? And how are we going to kind of make sure that we're better prepared as a kind of a whole of society, whole of government architecture going forward? And I think particularly here, the things that kind of came out from this piece of work was how do we scale up baseline knowledge for all agencies? And how do we define specific roles for key health and security agencies to account for these different threats? So for example, if we go back to the threat of African swine fever, if all of a sudden we get an outbreak of African swine fever in Fiji, it's not the Ministry of Health that's going to be looking at that, because this would fall under animal disease, so it would automatically kind of fall to the Ministry of Agriculture. But beyond that, who else is going to be involved? So by definition, pigs have to be slaughtered. And so who's going to do the slaughtering? It's probably not the Ministry of Agriculture, right? It's more likely to be the police or indeed the military, who have the tools of slaughter, if you like. And so how do you kind of find the right role for the right agency at the right time for the right threat? And I think this is the work that we're really kind of embarking on now with our partners in Fiji, and we think has really significant regional application. And I think it's really important to remember here that we talk about these kind of non-traditional threats, but they merge quite quickly with traditional security threats. So for example, if we are trying to monitor or disrupt transnational crime in the context of, say, illegal fishing, we might identify a boat that's sailing in the territorial waters of any Pacific Island Forum country. And we work with our partners and we get a kind of a response to that, and maybe it'll be a customs or navy or immigration or maritime authority who kind of board that boat. Now, we don't know where this boat has come from. We don't know who's on board and what they're carrying. And if you think about COVID, for example, or indeed rabies from dogs, all of a sudden your frontline security sector actors become a frontline risk for an emerging biological threat. And so I think what's really, really important here is that giving the knowledge and developing the occupational safety protocols for all actors is actually critically important to their own health, but the national security of the particular country and indeed the region involved. And so I think what this work really did was kind of highlight the importance of building these capabilities so that we have an expectation that so for example the Fiji police that they would be able to tell the difference at a very kind of basic level between COVID and dengue or African swine fever or fall armyworm or whatever it was, and they would therefore know their role not only to protect their own health but as part of a kind of a broader kind of architecture of response as well. Thank you. Next slide. The second thing that we've been working on over the last 2 to 3 years actually is, okay, so if we're going to really develop a health and security architecture of people, really, of human resources that can engage in preventing and responding to existential and non-traditional security threats, we really need to build the capabilities and the partnerships at a kind of a whole of government level. And so with that in mind, we worked really closely with colleagues from Fiji National University, and we developed what was a health and security course. Now, this health and security course takes on and draws from the framework of the Boe Declaration. And within the course, we looked at, in terms of content, we look at food security, water security, climate change, and pandemic preparedness. So that's kind of the content matter. But we then take a deep dive into the multi-agency implications of this. And who are we going to work with? Who's going to be responsible for this? How do we kind of ensure that our role is considered in the national response? And really kind of fostering those discussions. So what we were asked to do by the Ministry of Defence in Fiji is to trial this course. And we trialled that last year in 2022 at Blackrock, the Fiji military facility that is specialising increasingly in being a centre of excellence really in responding to regional disasters, natural and otherwise. A fantastic facility, and we brought to that facility, we brought representation from immigration, customs, the Fiji police, the RFMF, agriculture, ministries of health, and a range of other agencies and civil society as well, in terms of being, in terms of the kind of drawing on the strength of civil society and really making that kind of front and centre in how we did this. Now, what we would do is that we would look at a particular topic, whether it's, for example, in food security, and we would have Fijian national experts in food security partnered up with one of the multilats from the PIF or the SPC, and really kind of back and forthing on a kind of in a panel kind of format, and what were the critical health and security nexuses of these particular issues. Now, what was really interesting here was the dynamic between the panelists and the participants, and this really became an open kind of forum of discussion whereby we were seeing ideas being presented and then those ideas being challenged and interrogated by emerging leaders from these different agencies. It was a terrific opportunity to work with so many good people. The idea now is that we've piloted this course. We had 30 people running through it, so that should be 30 more people that are willing to work across this nexus of health and security. The idea is to now take this course into the region, and the next offering being a regional offering. And so slowly, or quickly, we start to build the sheer number of people that understand the importance of the health and security nexus, understand how to work across different agencies, and are more professionally engaged across different networks of these different agencies across the region. We think that's really important for building a much more solid human resource and architecture to cope with what will be increasing existential threats. Thank you. And finally, I just want to kind of to speak to some of our upcoming work in the northern regions of Fiji. We're calling it the Northern Trial, which is shorthand for multi-agency early warning surveillance in the northern region. And the way this trial is kind of being established is that by definition it's multi-agency, and so by definition we will be looking to bring the best surveillance capabilities of all agencies. So we know, for example, that Maritime Authority and has surveillance capabilities in terms of illegal fishing or fishing more generally. We know that the health guys have really good surveillance capabilities in the context of disease detection for human conditions. We know the ag guys have really good capabilities in the surveillance of livestock, plant and animal diseases. So the idea is to bring together the best of these surveillance activities that are already going on into one kind of one structure, if you like, and to kind of test it and to see how it can kind of complement each other. So this will be built around 4 tabletop exercises that are drawn from real, present, and possible health and security threats that would have widespread implications for communities. So, for example, we might look at an African swine fever outbreak. We might look at what happens if our water supply gets contaminated, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of work through the ideas, in terms of scenario planning. But the idea is that it really draws from what is already happening. But the really key part of this trial is that we'll be consistently engaging in a community-orientated way, but building out of the community into the provinces and the regional levels as well. And particularly looking, for that dynamic between decision makers in the northern region and decision makers in Suva. And so we think that's a really critical part of the design of this project, whereby what might look like a trial, what might look like a tabletop exercise, is actually informing real-time possible interventions that would mitigate, prevent, and certainly respond to threats at this nexus of health and security. So I think today what we've really done here is just kind of just lightly touched on the health and security nexus. We here at the Australian Pacific Security College think this is hugely important, and we know that our many partners in the region do as well, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you all as we go forward, and we can continue to build the human resource capabilities and capacities to really give tangible voice and demonstration to what was a remarkable Leaders' Declaration in the Boe Declaration. Thank you.